Are you ready to hear a story? Well, today I'm going to tell you a story about a princess who was locked up inside for a long time, but who eventually escaped. Can you think of any stories like that? Well, this isn't the story of Rapunzel, but I think it's even better. This story is called The Bear, and it goes like this. Once upon a time, there was a king who had just one daughter. Now, the queen had died years ago, when the princess was still very young, and losing her had made him very sad and afraid that he might lose his daughter as well. Frightened that something would happen to her if she ever left the palace where they lived, he ordered her never to leave and paid the servants to stop her if she should ever try to escape. As a child, the princess had been very happy to stay in the palace with her father. There were all sorts of rooms to explore inside, and she had lots of lovely toys to play with, so she didn't mind. But as she grew older, she started to get a bit bored of being shut up indoors all the time, and longed for adventures out in the world beyond. Now, her nurse, who had watched the girl grow up and loved her just as much as if she was one of her own children, could see that the princess was unhappy, and thought to herself, "This is no way for a young lady to live her life." What the king and the princess did not know is that the nurse was secretly a witch with the power to work magic spells to help those she cared for. One fine sunny day, when the princess was moping about in her room, gazing out of her window at the way the sun was lighting up the hills beyond the palace grounds, the nurse came over to her and said, "I can help you to escape this place, but first you'll need to ask your father for a wheelbarrow and a bear's skin." "What on earth would I do with a wheelbarrow and a bear's skin?" the princess exclaimed, laughing in her surprise. "If you can get those things for me, then I will use my magic powers to make the wheelbarrow run by itself with no one to push it, and turn the bear skin into a covering for you so that no one would ever recognise you," she explained. The princess blinked, astonished. She had no idea what to say to this. "What would you have said?" "You might not believe me now," the nurse continued, "but I'm your only hope of getting out of here, so you may as well give it a go. What have you got to lose?" "What should I tell my father I need them for?" asked the princess after a pause. The nurse rolled her eyes. "Use your initiative, girl," she said, and left the room. Well, as the princess had predicted, the king was rather baffled by her request and asked what she planned to do with them. She thought about this for a while. "I've decided to put on a play and I need some props for my show," she said. "Oh, how wonderful," said the king. "Did you write it? What's it about?" "It's a surprise," she said. "Oh, how exciting," said the king. "Will there be a part for me?" "No," exclaimed the princess, and then, "Sorry, it's a one-woman show?" "Ah, I see," said the king, smiling. "Well, I look forward to seeing it. I'll get them delivered for you tomorrow." And he ruffled her hair as if she were a little girl. But the king was true to his word, and the next day they arrived at the palace in big wooden crates. The princess called for her nurse, and together they excitedly prized the boxes open, checking that no one was around to watch them. Out of her pocket, the nurse drew a long, thin wooden wand, which she touched to the wheelbarrow. No sooner had she laid the very tip of her wand upon it than the wheelbarrow began to rush and dart about in all directions until she touched it again to make it stop. The princess could barely believe her eyes, but there was no time to stand around staring, as they might be caught at any moment. "Don't just stand there gawping," said the nurse. "Get inside the bearskin." So she did, and the nurse touched her magic wand to the skin, and immediately the fur stitched itself together and everything fell into place so that the princess looked just like a real bear. "Take my magic wand with you," said the nurse. "When you're ready to come out of the skin, You only need to touch your arm once and it will open to let you out. If you need to, you can hide yourself away again in the same way. Now get inside the wheelbarrow. It will take you where you need to go. You can use the wand to steer it, but stay low in the barrow and act like an empty skin for now, just until you're out of the palace grounds. It was time to go. The princess's big black bear eyes welled up with tears. She gave the nurse a big warm bear hug and gave her a note to leave in her bedroom for her father to find, which said that she was sorry to leave him, but explaining that she couldn't bear to stay shut up inside any longer. "Now go," said the nurse, and the wheelbarrow began to trundle off of its own accord, and the nurse watched sadly. Well, after the princess had travelled for many hours in her wheelbarrow, travelling on into a neighbouring kingdom, she eventually came to a deep, dark wood, and here she decided to stay and rest for a while. She was beginning to get a bit uncomfortable being squashed up inside the wheelbarrow, but she thought she'd travelled far enough now to be safe from anyone who might know her. Now it happened that the prince of that kingdom was out walking his dogs in the forest, and when they caught sight of the bear hiding among the shrubs, the dogs began to run towards it, barking and growling. The princess cried out in fear, "Please call off your dogs or they'll kill me." The prince was completely amazed, but he did as she asked. He called his dogs back to him and put them on a lead. "You can talk," he said, finally, flabbergasted. "Oh yes," she said, "but no one can know. I only spoke to you because I had no choice. I'm on the run, you see, from some people who are trying to catch me and lock me away." "Oh, that's terrible," said the prince, who was a kind-hearted sort of fellow and didn't like the thought of anyone else suffering, even if it was a bear. "I have an idea though. Why don't you come with me? There's plenty of room at my castle, so you can hide out there for as long as you need to." The Princess Bear eyed him up and down suspiciously. "All right," she said, "but no funny business. I want you to know that if you try anything, I have a magic wand and I'm not afraid to use it." The prince raised his eyebrows, but the Princess Bear wasn't looking. She was already bundling herself back into the wheelbarrow. "Hop in then," she said, grinning at him. Since she was a bear, the grin looked a bit scarier than she'd meant it to, but when the wheelbarrow started moving forwards, he soon understood and climbed in beside her. "Which way?" The prince pointed and she followed the direction with her wand, and off they went, up and down hills, over bumpy paths, and all the while the dogs running along and yapping beside them. Well, you might imagine the surprise of the rest of the house when the prince arrived back home, riding in a magical wheelbarrow with an enormous bear. But the king and queen were good, kind people and didn't ask too many questions when the bear begged them not to, and they were happy to lend her a bedroom for a few weeks if she needed it. After all, she was a very polite and well-spoken bear. Over time, they grew to love her as one of the family. She was thoughtful and gentle with the prince's little brothers and sisters. She was neat and tidy and helped out with the housework. She was clever and funny and they enjoyed her conversation. Even the dogs eventually got used to her, and she loved nothing more than running around in the hills and the forest with them and the prince. She was so big and strong and fast as a bear that she could even keep up with his horses. But the one thing they didn't know about her was that every night, before she went to bed, she would step out of her bear skin and go to sleep as her true self. They seemed like nice people, but she didn't quite trust them not to send her back to her father's just yet. After the Princess Bear had lived with them a week or two, the prince and his parents received an invitation to another palace for a ball, and they were all very excited to go. "I'd like to go," said the bear miserably. "I've never been to a ball before." "Come off it," laughed the prince, nudging her playfully. "What would people say if we showed up with a bear? Besides, it wouldn't be safe. Not many talking bears about. Someone would be bound to tell the people who were looking for you. Not for the first time, the princess was desperate to tell them all the truth, but she held her tongue. "You're right, of course," she said. "A bear could never go to a ball." The prince looked at her kindly. "I'll bring you back something nice, I promise." In the evening, the family set off for the ball in their carriage, but as soon as they had gone, the princess tiptoed into her room, where she slipped out of her bearskin and into a beautiful dress which she had used the magic wand to make out of glittering moonlight. Next, she used the wand to transform her wheelbarrow into a carriage of her own, and off she went to join the party, giggling happily to herself. When she entered the ballroom, her moonbeam dress was so spectacular that everyone turned their heads to stare at her. As for the princess herself, she was just as astonished by the ballroom as everyone else was by her. She'd never seen so many people crammed into one room before. Lots of people asked her to dance, so she got to chat to all sorts of interesting people and find out all about them. It was everything she'd ever wanted. Of course, she did get asked a lot of questions about herself, but she brushed them aside, telling people that she had come a long way from over the ocean and was only here for a short time and was due to return home very soon. Lucky for her, no one in the room knew enough about geography to ask her more questions about where she was from, and so she was free to make a few things up. Eventually, just as she'd hoped, she bumped into the prince, who had found her all that time ago in the woods and had taken her home, and for the rest of the night they stayed together, talking and laughing. "There's something so familiar about you," he said eventually. "I have a friend at home who would absolutely love you, you know. You've got such a similar sense of humour." "Well," she said, smiling to herself, "you'll have to introduce me sometime." Said the prince. "Well, you see, she's very sick and can't leave her bed," he lied, remembering his promise to keep his friend, the bear, safe. "Oh, what a shame," said the princess, and turned her face away so that he couldn't see her laughing. When she'd recovered herself, she turned back to him and removed her necklace, saying, "Here, give this to your friend and tell her I was sorry that she couldn't come." Eventually, the party ended and it was time to head home. The princess hopped into her carriage and used her magic wand to make it travel extra fast to make sure that she could beat the prince and the king and queen home and nobody would follow her. As soon as she was within sight of the palace, she turned the carriage back into a wheelbarrow and tiptoed upstairs to her bedroom to put on her bearskin again, stifling giggles as she did it. Before long, the prince was knocking gently at her door, and she opened it, doing her best to look sad and lonely. "Well, tell me all about it then," she sighed. "Did you have a wonderful time?" "I did," said the prince, "and I met someone who you would have loved. You know, she reminded me a lot of you." Princess Bear snorted. "Don't be silly," she said. "How could a princess remind you of me?" "Well, she was clever and funny and full of life, and she sounded just like you," he said. "She said she came from a faraway kingdom and she'd been travelling all over the world by herself, just like you've always said you wanted to. And she was kind. I told her I had a friend at home who was sick and couldn't come, and so she gave me this to give to you. See, I told you I'd bring you something nice." "It's very pretty," she said, looking down at the necklace he was holding out to her. "But I'm not sure how I'm going to wear it." He shrugged. "Maybe make it a bracelet instead?" "Anyway, if it's no good, don't worry. I swiped you some cake as well." He laughed and pulled a pretty little chocolate cake wrapped in a napkin out of his jacket pocket. "It'll do," she said, coughing in playfully. A few days later, the prince was invited to another ball, and he was desperate to go, hoping beyond hope that he might see the same princess there again. It all happened much the same as the first time, only this time the princess magicked herself a dress out of sunbeams that shone and blazed even more beautifully than the last one. This time, when she entered the room, the prince didn't wait for her to come and find him, which is probably just as well, because there was plenty for her to be distracted by. They spent the whole night chatting together, barely leaving each other's sides, but at the end of the night, the princess told him that she'd have to return home the following week, but she hoped he might be able to visit her in her kingdom one day. The prince was sad. Even though he couldn't explain it, and even though he'd only met her twice, he felt like he'd known this princess for a long time, and he knew that he was completely in love with her. He pulled a ring from his finger. "Take this to remember me by, and as soon as you're home, write to me here and tell me when I can come and see you again." "I will," she said, "but only if you promise to invite me round to meet your friend before I leave." The prince was desperate to say yes, and somehow felt like he could trust this princess, but he couldn't forget his promise to keep his friend safe. He felt as though his heart would break. "I'm sorry," he said eventually. "She's not well enough. We have to protect her." And that was when the bear princess knew for certain that she could trust him with her secret. When the ball ended, the princess once again rushed off before the prince could stop her, and her coach travelled far too fast for him to be able to keep up. Once again, the prince knocked at the bear's bedroom door and gave her some cake from the party and told her all about the princess he had met. "Oh, she sounds lovely," the bear smiled, shoveling the cake into her mouth. And as she raised her hand, it was then that the prince saw his own ring flashing on her claw. "How did you—" The bear princess couldn't keep her laughter in anymore. She was laughing so hard that she could barely lift an arm to point the magic wand at her arm. But eventually she managed to reveal her true identity, and she told the prince her story, and they decided to get married and travel the world together. But before they left, there was just one more thing to do. What do you think it was? That's right, they went to pay a visit to the princess's father, who was so happy to see his daughter again that he cried and cried and cried. Seeing how happy she was with the prince, he promised to never try to keep her shut up again, on one condition: that she never run off like that again without telling him where she was going, and that she send him postcards and tell him all about her adventures all around the world so that he would always know that she was safe. And of course, she did. That was the story of the bear. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you again next week.